Hi students, so welcome to our next review video. This specific one is going to be talking about absolutism. So we're moving on into a different period, and a lot of this absolutism, at least if we're going to be talking about the causes of absolutism, is really going to be because of first the Renaissance ideas that we had talked about earlier with Machiavelli. But really it's going to be the Protestant Reformation, in which that the power from the Pope and the Catholic Church is going to start to diminish, and you're going to see that these kings and queens are going to start to take more power for themselves. So there's going to be a few different countries that we're going to be talking about, a few different empires and dynasties that we'll kind of talk about in this case to try to give you an overview, like I said, a brief overview of absolutism. Now, in the Protestant Reformation video, I had talked about France. I told you about, Francis the First, and then, the two sons, that followed him, Henry and Charles, and then you're going to have Henry of Navarre, who is going to take over. And it's Catherine de' Medici's son-in-law. He's a Huguenot, but then he converts to Catholicism, saying that Paris is worth a mass. One of the main things, like we said, that he does do is this Edict of Nantes, which grants religious toleration for everyone in France. Now, eventually, that's going to be, taken over. It's going to be, removed once we get into the later dynasties. But this was starting to show greater absolutism type of power. Now, is Henry of Navarre, Henry the Fourth, is he exactly a absolute monarch? No, but he's setting up the stage for them. So when Henry of Navarre dies, Louis the 13th is going to take over. And Louis XIII is a very, very weak ruler, in which Cardinal Richelieu is going to be really the person that's running the show, as like his advisor and whatnot. And Cardinal Richelieu and Louis XIII are going to be the two people that are going to be in this 30 Years' War, fighting, for greater dominance in Europe. And France, actually fights on the Protestant side of this, even though Cardinal Richelieu himself is a Catholic. So when I remember, Louis XIII is a very, very weak leader, and when he dies, his 4-year-old son's going to take over Louis the 14th. Okay, and when Louis the 14th is very, very young, there's going to be a noble rebellion. It's going to be called the Fronde, and Louis the 14th is always going to remember this. So when we get a little bit later down the road here, kind of makes sense. So Louis XIV eventually, grows up, becomes, the model, the Sun King, as he calls himself, because he said that the sun, because he's like the sun, that Europe is going to revolve around him and whatnot. And Louis XIV is going to be more fashion. Everyone wants to be Louis. He's going to really raise, the ballet and artwork, and we'll get into artwork in a little bit. So Louis XIV is kind of like this person that everyone wants to be, all throughout Europe. And he's going to be this model, and he's going to be ruling for over 70 some years. And what he does is that he builds this grand palace, this Palace of Versailles. This huge palace, in which he starts bringing in the nobles to live there, and it's right outside Paris. And he is one of those individuals, because of the Fronde and because of this noble rebellion that was happening when he was really, really young. He was trying to keep them close. It's keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer. So he was like, what? If they're going to be inside of my house, they're not going to be plotting anything, because they're going to be too afraid that I'm going to find something out. Something that Louis is also very well known for is all of his wars. And his wars are going to drain the economy. So that doesn't exactly help his situation, whatsoever, especially, 100 some years later, when Louis the 16th has to deal with the French Revolution and everyone kind of being dead, and eventually he's going to die. Another thing that Louis kind of brings in, like we said, was this artwork. And this new type of artwork is called Baroque art. So this Baroque art is very bold, it's very gaudy, it's kind of showing off, and it's kind of a direct consequence or a direct effect of this Protestant Reformation, where now these, kings and queens just want to show off, and Baroque art is going to be where it's going to be, shown off. And it's, if you're looking at like the paintings, it's got very, very dark backgrounds, but then like, bright, like coming out, like it's just very bold. It's like in your face, and like the altars are on your face, and it's like gold and gaudy type of furniture. So the Palace of Versailles is all decked out in this Baroque artwork. So that is something that is going to be more well known with regards to Louis XIV. One of the last wars that Louis XIV engages himself into is something called the War of Spanish Succession. Now, Louis is a Bourbon or a Bourbon. So what happens is that Charles II of Spain dies without an heir. He was unable to produce children, mostly because of the incest that had been going on within his family for multiple generations. And so he dies without an heir. And when that happens, there's now going to be a war over who should actually be ruling in Spain. Should it be a Bourbon? Should it be a Habsburg? No one really knows, but people start, having this war. And by the very, very end of this war of Spanish Succession, Louis is able to put a Bourbon on the throne of Spain. However, they had to rule as different families. So Louis, if you're going to look at it this way, since it's separate families, doesn't maintain control of Spain. And that's pretty much what everyone in Europe was kind of looking for. They were trying to make sure that, he was, not going to control both of these territories. So that kind of leaves off France with eventually Louis XV taking over and whatnot, and Colbert, the finance minister, that's for the Bourbon dynasty, coming up with this idea of mercantilism, which we had discussed in an earlier video. So the next country that we're going to focus on is going to be England. And when we're talking about England, we're talking about this absolute, this way of going to absolutism. It really starts with Henry VIII. Yeah, we can talk about Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, too, that he started some ideas of trying to maintain control, but it's really going to be Henry VIII and everything that he does to break away from the Catholic Church, which we had talked about with the Anglicans and whatnot. But where the story kind of continues with England, with this battle of absolutism, is going to be with his children, and then the dynasty after that. So when Henry VIII dies, it goes to his son, Edward VI. Edward VI is, young. He dies within a few short years. It then goes to Mary I, who is a Catholic, and she's very unpopular, not only because she's a Catholic, but because she's also married to Philip II of Spain. And in England, they're like, oh, wow, it's Philip II of Spain. Like, no, we don't like exactly who you're married to. And she does start to assert absolute power by killing off, and persecuting Anglicans. Now, she isn't queen very, very long, because then she ends up dying herself, in a very, few short years, where then Elizabeth will take over, and this becomes this golden age of England, where Elizabeth starts thriving and making England into a world-dominating power through, what we would kind of say of this colonization and colonialism. Also, there's going to be new artwork, writing. This is the time of William Shakespeare. So things are going quite well for Elizabeth. Now, the one thing that Elizabeth does do is that she does remove political enemies when she needs to. For example, her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, that she eliminated from the picture by, way of execution, because she was afraid that, people would put Mary, Queen of Scots in because of her religious affiliations, and she was from Scotland. So there was some, possibility that, there could be the two crowns connected together. When Elizabeth does die, she does not have any heirs to the throne. She was never married. So she gives her authority, she gives her whole dynasty, her dynasty ends, but she gives her throne to her cousin, which is Mary, Queen of Scots' son, who's going to be James the First of England, James the Sixth of Scotland. Okay? And when that happens, the Stuart dynasty begins, and now we start having a more of a unification between Scotland and England, that now a Scottish leader is now in charge of England. And James the First really makes it known that he is an absolute type of person, that he doesn't really care what Parliament thinks. It's his way or the highway. And his son is even more of an absolute monarch, Charles the First. Charles the First signs something called the Petition of Right. And when he signs the Petition of Right, what Parliament was trying to do was limit his power in exchange for money for Charles to go to war. Well, Charles never honors the agreement, okay, and he just never calls onto Parliament, and it's going to get into this one instance where there's going to start to be a rebellion. It's going to be an English civil war that's going to happen within England between Tories / the Cavaliers, people who are supporters of the king, and then you're going to have the Whigs, people who were against this. And eventually what's going to happen is the king's going to lose. Oliver Cromwell, who's a Puritan, is going to take over power, and he is going to make it into a protectorate, that he's Lord Protector, and England becomes this like Puritan type of society for a few years where there's no music or dancing, no drinking. Okay, so he's going to make it like very like Puritan like. Think of it as like the town in Footloose before they all start dancing and whatnot by the end of the movie. And they execute Charles the First. Well, eventually Oliver Cromwell dies, and then Oliver Cromwell, the next person that takes over is another Cromwell, and he's not as strong. They remove him, and they bring back this English restoration. So they're restoring the English crown, and they restore back with the Stuarts. And they bring this guy in who is Charles I's son. His name is Charles II, and he's known as the Merry Monarch. So everyone kind of like, things are going back to, normal again until the Merry Monarch, dies. And then it's his brother, James II, that takes over. And he is an absolute monarch, trying to bring back the old ways of the Stuart Dynasty. And when that occurs, this is where now the people start to rise and say, we can't do this again. So they secretly talk to James II's daughter, Mary, who's married to William of Orange, who's a Netherlands prince, William and Mary, and they agree that they will come over and they will be the ruling party. They'll sign this English Bill of Rights, making sure that people have rights, that the Parliament has rights. And this whole revolution is called the Glorious or Bloodless Revolution because no one dies. And then, like, after William and Mary are done ruling, when they die, it's going to be the other daughter. It's going to be Anne, Queen Anne. And then it goes into this whole Hanover dynasty, whereas your Georges, George I, George II, George III, and we all know the Georges in the Hanover dynasty with American Revolution from your United States history, and their prime minister in the very beginning of the Hanover dynasty, Robert Walpole, that really starts to engage in this idea of salutary neglect, trying to leave these colonies alone, especially if they're prospering. So that's what we're going to stop right now for England. Other places that are kind of going on, well, the Dutch. Okay, the Dutch are also involved in, this glorious time period in which then they start and they break away from Spain after a few, rebellions and revolutions. This is William the Silent, who's also known as William of Orange as well. And once they break away from Spain, in the late 1500s, early 1600s, this enters into the Dutch Golden Age, where you have the Dutch East India Trading Company and new Dutch artists like Van Eyck and Rembrandt that are creating, new types of paintings and whatnot. So the Dutch are even going through this golden age, but eventually even wars are going to bring the Dutch down because now they were spending a lot of money just defending themselves from Louis XIV and all of his wars. Other places that are rising up, Russia, okay? A few of your main people in Russia, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, even though they're kind of more enlightened despots, we'll talk about them right now, but Peter the Great was trying to westernize Russia and emulate just like France. So people had to shave their beards off, and the education that they're trying to bring was trying to bring more westernized. The only thing that they really don't do is they don't really kind of bring the industry in as a westernized nation. They are still kind of focusing on agriculture. And Prussia becomes a new country, and you have all of your Fredericks and Frederick Williams, but they're more of a military state. So they were using the military to control, items. And then the last country we're going to be talking about is Austria. And Austria starts to form into a very powerful Central European power, mostly because Charles VI doesn't have an heir except for his daughter Maria Theresa. So he passes the Pragmatic Sanction. And when he passes the Pragmatic Sanction, he declares that, yes, in a case where there's no other heir, a daughter can take over, or a female can take over, and gives her power. But this brings out another war, the War of Austrian Succession, in which Maria Theresa has to fight in order to defend her reign in this whole entire thing. So you can see that absolutism, this idea where they feel that God has told them that they have the power, that God told them specifically that they have the right to rule, okay? It's not, just given by the people. So this is going to lead into ideas of the Enlightenment, which is going to be our next video that we're going to be talking about, which is the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. But it leads into this idea of the Enlightenment, this idea of, you know what? God tells me I can do this. It's central power, if there's no order, there's going to be chaos, and it's going to lead into all sorts of philosophical thinking. So you can see how we're having some causes and effects. Well, thank you again for joining with me with this. It was supposed to be brief, but it's actually, this was actually pretty brief, even though it's almost 20 minutes long. But thank you for watching. Once again, you can subscribe if you want to, see when all these new videos are coming up, or, you can see that I'll have the playlist and you just go on to the next show. Well, thank you very much, and good luck on your test.